He took a job caring for an alien and discovered a secret no one told him. The first thing Eric noticed when the transport ship hit atmosphere was the color of the sky. It wasn't the usual dull blue of Earth or the melancholic hues of Mars. It was a radiant, almost surreal violet that bled into the horizon like spilled ink. The air was thinner, but the view unbelievable. He almost forgot why he was there in the first place, almost his mission well. Technically, job was simple in the grand scheme of intergalactic odd jobs. It was supposed to be routine, a caretaker, not a nanny, not a bodyguard, not a diplomat. Just a guy making sure an alien woman didn't do anything drastic while living out her stay on a distant planet in the Solara system. That was it, simple, easy, and the pay ridiculously good. They promised him more than what his father had earned in his entire life working in the IT department of a grocery store. Enough to retire, enough to, well, not retire, but at least buy a really nice house in one of those fancy suburban neighborhoods that look like something out of a magazine. So yeah, he jumped at the offer, not caring that the Galactic Employment Agency's ads were written in overly flowery language and boasted about exotic locations he'd never heard of. Who cared about where the paycheck was enough? That was the kind of pragmatic thinking that led him to pack his bags, leave Earth gravity well, and step into the unknown. Upon landing, Eric was greeted by a small silent shuttle that hovered just a few feet off the ground, its sleek design glistening under the strange light of the planet's twin moons. A voice came through the ship's CAL system, deep, almost robotic. Please proceed to the shuttle, Eric. Low, your charge is awaiting your arrival. It wasn't until he stepped off the ship and into the strange alien atmosphere that Eric began to question just how routine this job was going to be. The shuttle didn't take him far, just a short, silent ride to a stone complex, one that looked both ancient and modern at the same time. Like a relic from some long-lost civilization, but with touches of technology so advanced it felt alien. Even by human standards, the door slid open with a hiss, and there she was. She looked like a human woman at first, tall, graceful, and strikingly beautiful, but then his eyes caught the detail that made her not human. Her ears, they were long, longer than any human's, tapering into fine points that looked almost delicate. They shimmered slightly in the light, as if dusted with some iridescent powder. She was dressed in flowing robes of a material that looked like liquid metal, shifting hues as she moved. Her gaze locked on him, and her lips parted slightly, revealing a smile that was both welcoming and slightly unnerving. She wasn't wearing any shoes, and when she stepped forward, her bare feet made a soft, almost musical sound on the polished stone beneath her. You must be Eric, she said in a voice that had an otherworldly lilt to it. Eric blinked, caught off guard. He'd seen pictures, sure, but nothing had really prepared him for the surreal beauty of her presence. Yeah, he said, scratching the back of his neck. That's me. He immediately felt awkward. He wasn't sure whether to shake her hand or just fall over in awe. I am Kira, she said, her voice light but full of authority. You may address me as you like, though I prefer something more personal, perhaps. Quickly, Eric repeated, trying to keep his tone casual, even though it felt like his mouth was dry. Nice to meet you, so I'm here to, well, look after you, I guess. Smile never faltered. She seemed amused. Look after me? Indeed, but you must understand this isn't a one-sided arrangement. I have expectations, Eric. This will not be a typical job for you. Her eyes gleamed, and Eric couldn't help but feel a shiver run down his spine. Expectations, he repeated, thinking to himself. Great, just what I need, a mysterious alien with expectations. Kwai nodded slowly, her long ears twitching slightly. Yes, I'm not accustomed to human men. You will need to learn how to interact with me, follow my cues, respond appropriately. Eric raised an eyebrow. Interact? Like what exactly? He immediately regretted asking that. What if she was one of those weird aliens? He'd seen enough vids about how strange some of these galactic species could be. He wasn't sure he was ready for anything too out there. She laughed, light, musical, and Eric could tell it wasn't the first time she'd heard someone react like this. Don't worry, Eric, I'm sure we will have a wonderful time learning about each other, but for now let me show you to your quarters. As they walked through the stone hallways, continued to speak, as though the idea of Eric's unease was amusing to her. I know you've read the job description, but you must understand The agency can't include everything. It would be unwise to prepare you fully. That would ruin the fun. Her eyes twinkled with something more mischievous than welcoming. Eric did his best to keep up with her as they passed rooms full of odd technological devices, spheres that floated midair, holographic images that flickered in and out of view. It was a lot to take in, and he felt a little disoriented. He had the sudden urge to ask her if there was a coffee machine. He could definitely use a caffeine fix. After all this weirdness, they reached a set of double doors that opened with a soft whoosh. On the other side was a room that honestly looked like a five-star hotel suite. There was plush seating made of some alien fabric that shimmered in the light, a view of the violet sky, and a large circular bed that seemed to hover slightly above the floor. "This is your room," said, gesturing grandly, "and this, Eric, is where you'll be spending your time. While you're here, you're free to explore the city, of course, but I will require your presence every evening." "Every evening," Eric repeated, still trying to wrap his head around everything. "Yes," she replied, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. "Every evening. We will discuss the day's events. You will keep track of your duties, and of course you will learn. There's much you can learn from me." Eric nodded slowly, trying not to look completely overwhelmed. "Right, okay, that sounds simple enough, I guess." She smiled again, that same enigmatic smile. "It will be," she said, "if you are willing to learn." And as the doors closed behind her, Eric couldn't help but wonder what in the galaxy he had just got himself into. He had no idea if he was supposed to feel like this was a standard job, or if he was just some unwitting participant in a cosmic game that was beyond his understanding. What he did know was that was going to make this far more complicated than he ever imagined, but at least the pay was good. Eric woke up to the sound of chimes, not the kind that played in Earth's fancy hotels, but something far stranger. It was like the sound of wind chimes made from the bones of an ancient creature, resonating with a tone so clear it seemed to vibrate directly through his bones. He groggy blinked. The soft light of the planet's twin suns filtering through the windows. Kay had said he could sleep in, but his internal clock was still running on Earth time, which meant he was wide awake at what could only be described as an ungodly hour. Sitting up in bed, he rubbed his eyes and glanced at the peculiar room around him. The walls shimmered with iridescent patterns, almost like the room was a live alien. He had to get used to that. This wasn't some vacation, it wasn't even a trip. He was working, but it didn't feel like it. The bed, which seemed to conform to his body's exact needs, had made sleep feel like a strange, addictive escape, and now he was fully awake, yet oddly disoriented. The chimes continued, soft and melodic. Confident, then he felt the robot made a soft beeping noise, as though it were checking something on its internal database. "You are the designated passenger for Neoria. Please follow me to the transport compartment." Eric raised an eyebrow. "A designated passenger? How many passengers are on this thing exactly?" "None," the robot said, its tone a little too cheerful. "This shuttle is exclusively for your use. I trust you are prepared for the journey." "Prepared?" "I assure prepared." Eric paused, looking at the shuttle's pristine interior. "Prepared for what exactly?" The robot tilted its head, its servos making a soft warring noise. "For the dangers of Neoria. Of course, the planet is unpredictable." The last word was said in a way that made Eric wonder if this robot knew something it wasn't telling him. "Dangers, huh?" Eric said, feeling a sudden chill creep up his spine. "Like what kind of dangers?" The robot didn't answer, instead turning on its heel and motioning for Eric to follow. With no other options, he stepped inside, trying to ignore the subtle unease that had begun to settle in his stomach. The shuttle's interior was luxurious in a way that was almost over the top. The chairs were made of a soft plush material that Eric was pretty sure was some kind of alien fabric. There were small glowing orbs embedded in the walls, casting a calming pastel light that seemed to pulse with each of his movements. But what struck him most was the window, a panoramic view of space that stretched out beyond the ship like the universe was holding its breath as the shuttle took off. Eric couldn't help but be momentarily distracted by the beauty of it all. He leaned forward, watching the stars blur into streaks of light as they accelerated. It was breathtaking. He'd seen the vids, of course, but nothing compared to actually being out here speeding through the cosmos with nothing but a seat belt and a robot as your travel companion. But then he remembered Neoria, a planet on the edge of known Space, a place that sounded like it was straight out of a bad horror hollow. He had no idea what he was walking into. Maybe had a special interest in dangerous flowers, or maybe she was just playing games with him. Either way, he had to go. There was no turning back now. About an hour into the journey, the robot steward approached him again, its metallic feet making a soft clinking sound on the floor. Please fasten your seat belt. We are entering the Nihiran atmosphere, it said, voice polite but firm. Eric reluctantly buckled in, the weight of the situation sinking in again. What was he getting himself into? As the shuttle descended toward Neoria, the planet came into view, a bleak rocky world with swirling toxic clouds hanging low over the surface. The atmosphere was thick, yellowish, and dense with storms rolling across the surface in violent, unpredictable patterns. If there was one thing Eric knew for sure, it was that this wasn't the kind of place you wanted to go on a vacation. Welcome to Neoria, the robot announced with a tone that made the name sound like a curse. I recommend you remain in the shuttle unless absolutely necessary. Thanks for the heads up, Eric muttered, but the robot was already turning to leave the shuttle. Touchdown with a soft jolt, and Eric quickly unbuckled his seatbelt, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. The door opened with another hiss, and the hot, fetid air rushed in, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of sulfur and something well alive. Stay close, the robot instructed as Eric stepped out onto the planet's surface. Eric felt a shiver run down his spine. The landscape was a jagged wasteland of dark rock and swirling, sickly yellow fog. The ground was uneven, pocked with craters and strange, glowing plants that seemed to pulse with a rhythm all their own. In the distance, he could see lightning crackling across the sky, illuminating the swirling clouds in brief flashes. It felt like the kind of place where things just shouldn't be. As he began to move forward, the robot led him to what looked like a cluster of bushes, thorny, thickle plants that seemed to sway in an unseen breeze. Among them, nestled, almost casually, was a flower. It was a brilliant shade of blue, a stark contrast against the grim surroundings, with petals that shimmered like they were made of liquid glass. The plant was surrounded by a faint, glowing aura, giving it an almost magical quality. There it is, the robot said, its tone neutral. The Nihiran bluebell, handle it carefully. Eric took a deep breath, eyeing the flower wearily. Something about it felt wrong, but it was the only thing he had asked for, and he'd come this far, so he stepped closer, reaching for the flower stem with tentative fingers. The moment his hand brushed against the petals, the ground beneath him trembled, the air turned frigid, and the sky seemed to darken, the clouds overhead churning like a storm about to break. Eric stumbled back, heart racing. What the hell? Before he could finish the thought, the earth split beneath his feet, sending him tumbling into a cavern below. He barely had time to react as he fell, hitting the rocky floor with a jarring thud. When Eric opened his eyes, he found himself in total darkness. His breath was ragged, his body aching from the fall, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear a low guttural growl. A distant voice echoed his head. It wasn't his voice, but it felt familiar. Remember, Eric adapt his fingers closed around the flower, which had somehow made it through the fall. Whatever was coming, he was going to need it. Eric's heart hammered in his chest as he lay sprawled on the cold, jagged floor of the cavern. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the distant echoes of the growls and the occasional rumbles from deep within the planet's bow. For a moment he wondered if he was about to be swallowed whole by whatever monstrous thing was lurking in the dark, but then, as his vision adjusted to the dim light emanating from the glowing blue flower in his hand, his mind started to focus. He'd survived worse, much worse. Actually, with a groan, he pushed himself into a sitting position, the remnants of his backpack still clinging to his back. Like some sort of alien fashion statement, for a brief moment, he considered sitting there and waiting. Waiting to be eaten, because that would be the easy thing to do, right? But then a thought hit him like a bolt of lightning. Kwai would never let me live it down if I didn't even try. This was her flower. He couldn't just leave it here. Pushing himself to his feet, he took a moment to shake off the disorientation. The cavern was vast and cavernous, its walls slick with an oily substance that glimmered in the faint light. The deeper he looked, the more he saw twisting, spiraling tunnels that seemed to go on forever, and odd glowing creatures darting about like fireflies on a bad acid trip. There was something both beautiful and eerie about it all, but one thing was certain: he wasn't alone. The growl came again, closer. This time Eric's hand tightened around the stem of the Niharan bluebell, the petals shimmering faintly in his grasp. What am I supposed to do with this? He thought, feeling the full weight of his idiocy settling in who actually needed a. Fell this badly, a shadow flickered at the edge of his vision before he could react. Something massive erupted from the darkness, scales gleaming in the dim light, eyes glowing like molten metal. It was a creature that looked like something out of an old sci-fi flick, all claws and teeth, with a mouth that seemed too large for its body. Its growl reverberated through the cavern, vibrating the very air. Great Eric muttered, backing up instinctively, just what I needed. The creature seemed to hesitate for a moment, its massive form shifting as if testing the air, then it lunged, its claws slicing through the cavern air with a sound that was like 1,000 knives scraping against stone. Eric barely had time to think before he dropped to the ground, rolling just out of reach of the creature's talons. The flower still in his hand glowed brighter in response to the danger, like it was reacting to the creature's aggression. He wasn't sure if that was good or bad, but it felt like his only chance. He scrambled to his feet, heart racing, and found himself staring into the creature's wide, menacing eyes. It was an ugly thing, scaly, with thick armor plating and horns that jutted out from its head like the spikes on a medieval mace. It was the kind of thing that looked like it could tear him apart with a single swipe. Okay, Eric, think his brain screamed at him to do something, anything. The flower was his only weapon, but what was he supposed to do? Wave it at the monster and hope it turned into a bouquet? A thought hit him like a meteor. What if it was a bouquet? With no better plan, Eric held the flower out in front of him, the petals shimmering as if it could somehow sense his desperation. The creature still hissing and growling paused. The air grew thick with tension. Eric swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the stem. He had no idea if this was going to work, but there was a small, stubborn part of him that refused to just curl up and die in a dank alien cavern. The creature blinked, cocking its head as it sniffed the air. Then, incredibly, it took a step back. Eric raised an eyebrow, blinking in disbelief. What the hell? Another step back. The creature's growl softened, its menacing posture starting to ease. It sniffed at the flower cautiously, its glowing eyes flicking to Eric, then back to the glowing petals. Well, I'll be damned, Eric muttered. Under his breath, he looked at the flower, then back at the creature. You like flowers, huh? You're not just a killing machine. After all, the creature snorted, its breath warm and putrid, but it didn't make another move to attack. Eric felt his shoulders relax, though his heart was still pounding in his chest. It was then that he heard the voice again. Remember, Eric, adapt. Eric blinked, realizing he was holding his breath. He could almost hear K's voice in his head, calm and authoritative, but with an edge that made it clear she wasn't going to tolerate failure. Right, adapt. The creature slowly took another step back, its eyes still locked on the flower, almost hypnotized by its glow. Eric, ever the opportunist, backed away cautiously, keeping the flower in front of him like a shield. He was willing to bet the creature wasn't really interested in him. It was the flower it wanted. Once he was a safe distance away, he dropped down onto a boulder, gasping for air that was way too close. His mind reeled. What was this flower? Some kind of mystical flower with mind-controlling properties, or was it just the fact that Nior was a strange place and the creatures that lived here had an unexplainable relationship with it? Either way, he wasn't about to question it. If the flower kept the thing at bay, he was going to keep it close. Eric sat there for a while, watching the creature back off into the shadows, still eyeing the flower as if it were the last bit of food on a desert planet. It didn't leave, but it didn't attack either. It just paced slowly, keeping its distance. Well, that's one way to handle things, Eric muttered to himself. I'll take it. After several minutes of tense silence, he finally stood up, glancing around. The creature wasn't going to attack for now. He had a window of opportunity. He turned toward the cavern's exit, where he knew they would be waiting. The flower faint glow bathed the rocks in a cool blue light, and for the first time since he arrived, Eric felt a little bit of hope, however strange it was. With the flower in hand, he made his way out of the cavern, carefully navigating the maze of rock formations. His steps felt lighter now, his mind more focused despite the still looming presence of the creatures somewhere in the darkness behind him. It didn't matter, he'd gotten the flower, and if that meant he had to face down more alien beasts, well, he'd cross that bridge when he came to it. But for now, he had a new mission: get back to the shuttle and somehow explain to Kwai that He'd survived with humor and maybe a joke or two about not getting eaten by alien beasts that he thought would probably be the key to surviving this job. After all, what was the worst that could happen? The shuttle was still where he left it, nestled against the rocky outcropping like a quiet, indifferent observer of the chaos that had unfolded around it. Eric approached cautiously. Keeping the glowing blue flower clutched tightly in his hand, he didn't trust the atmosphere on Neoria, and after what he'd just been through, that trust was in short supply. As he neared the shuttle, he half expected the creature to appear again, creeping out from the shadows to take another shot at the flower, or maybe to make a meal out of him. But the cavern was eerily silent, the growls now nothing more than a distant memory for the first time since his ill-advised mission to retrieve the Neoran bluebell. Eric allowed himself a small sigh of relief. The shuttle's hatch opened with a soft hiss, and the robot steward appeared once more, its round metallic eyes gleaming with an unsettling brightness. "Did you retrieve the flower?" it asked, its voice almost too polite, like it was trying to be reassuring, while still coming off as entirely nonchalant about the whole monster encounter situation. "Yeah, I got it," Eric said, trying to sound nonchalant even though he was still feeling the effects of adrenaline pulsing through his veins. "And if you ever plan to send someone on this mission again, maybe include a tiny warning about what's lurking down there." The robot tilted its head. "The dangers of Neor are well documented, but it is of course standard practice for your safety briefing to include only what is relevant to your immediate needs. The Neoran bluebell, being a delicate specimen, does not respond well to disturbances." Eric raised an eyebrow. "You're telling me this flower can make a monster show up?" The robot blinked. "The Neoran bluebell has unique properties. The local fauna, as you may have noticed, are sensitive to its aura. The creature you encountered is known as a Neoran warder. It reacts to the flower's energy by protecting it, though it does have a tendency to become possessive. Great flower with its own bodyguard," Eric muttered, stepping into the shuttle. "Just what I needed today." The robot didn't respond. Instead, it led him back to his seat and gestured for him to sit down. As Eric settled into the plush chair, he glanced out the window, watching the alien landscape of Neoria wrecked behind them. He was eager to put the planet and the mysterious creature behind him. "Well, I guess it's time to head back to wherever the hell is," he muttered, shifting the flower into a more comfortable grip. The glowing petals were still mesmerizing, casting an eerie light in the otherwise sterile cabin of the shuttle. As the shuttle lifted off, a strange feeling crept over him, a weird lingering sense that the flower wasn't just an ordinary specimen. He couldn't explain it, but there was something undeniably alive about it, the fact that it had protected him, that had seemed to respond to the dangers of Neoria in real time, made it feel almost sense, or at least aware. His thoughts were interrupted by the robot's cheerful voice. "You will be arriving at your destination shortly. Please prepare for docking." Eric gave the robot a nod and settled back in his seat, staring at the view screen as the stars grew more distant and the strange organic glow of Neoria faded into the endless void of space. The shuttle's engines hummed steadily, and for a moment Eric allowed himself to relax. The worst part of his job was over, and then, of course, his calm device buzzed. He fumbled for it, grumbling, "Perfect timing as always." The screen flickered to life, and Quez's familiar face appeared, her long ears flicking slightly with the transmission's slight static. Despite the distance, her expression was as commanding as ever, her sharp, calculating eyes studying him as if he were an object she was still figuring out how to use. "You have the flower?" she asked, her voice dripping with expectation. Eric held it up slightly begrudgingly. "Yeah, I got it. No thanks to your lovely planet and its monstrous wildlife's." Gaze softened just a fraction, barely perceptible, but it was there. "I trust you encountered no permanent harm?" she inquired, her tone shifting to something almost concerned, or maybe it was just polite formality. "I'm good," Eric said, trying to hide the weariness in his voice, a little bruised, a little shaken, but the flower intact. "You might want to put a tiny warning label on the planet's pure," though her eyes twinkled with a hint of amusement. "That would be a rather long brazier considering the risk associated with Neoria. I trust the creature you encountered was not overly aggressive." "Overly aggressive is an understatement," Eric muttered, glancing out the window. It was huge, looked like something out of a bad science fiction, hollow but don't Worry your flower still glowing and terrifying beautiful Kwai tilted her head slightly as if weighing his words. The Nearan wardrake is an ancient protector of the bluebell species it is. Fascinating in its way, its actions are purely driven by instinct in a way it is. Part of the flower's ecosystem. Eric blinked. Great, the flower got its own bouncer. I'm glad I didn't have to deal with that for too long. His expression shifted, becoming more thoughtful. The Nearan bluebell has been sought after by many for centuries. It is not merely a flower but a key to a much larger mystery. If you were able to survive its protection, then perhaps. Eric raised an eyebrow. Mystery, now you're really starting to sound like a mystery. Holok's lips quirked upward ever so slightly, an expression that could have been mistaken for a smile if it weren't so guarded. In a sense, you are correct. There is a larger story at play, one that involves far more than just a simple flower. You may have unwittingly opened door to something unexpected. Yeah, well, you're going to have to fill me in on the details later. Because I'm still a little bruised and battered, Eric said, glancing at the dim glow of the flower in his hand. What exactly am I supposed to do with this thing now? Regarded him carefully. For now you must get it to the lab. The flower's properties can only be properly studied in the correct environment. I will arrange for your transport. Eric groaned. Transport? You really know how to make a guy feel special, don't you? Chi didn't respond to that. Instead, she nodded in a way that made it clear the conversation was over. We will discuss further details when you arrive. Be sure to handle the flower with care. It is more valuable than you realize. The screen flickered off and Eric let out a long breath. He turned back toward the flower, which had returned to its quiet glow in his hand, its petals almost alive in a way he couldn't quite understand. Okay, flower, he said aloud, more to himself than anything else. Let's get you to wherever we're going next, and hope the next leg of this adventure doesn't involve a giant alien monster. As the shuttle continued its journey through the stars, Eric couldn't help but wonder what kind of mystery lay ahead, and more importantly, what kind of trouble he had just signed up for. The shuttle drifted into orbit around Veyron Station, a gleaming silver structure that looked more like a floating sculpture than a place of scientific study. Eric gazed out the viewport, his eyes narrowed. Against the glare of the star, the station's silhouette loomed large against the backdrop of deep space, almost serene in its cold precision. But Eric knew better. He had no illusions about what was waiting for him inside. The Nearan bluebell sat beside him, glowing softly as ever, its petals undisturbed by the gentle turbulence of the shuttle's entry into the station's gravitational field. The flower was, to put it bluntly, a ticking time bomb of mystery and importance, and in Eric's case, a reminder that things were about to get even stranger. The shuttle's engine hummed to a stop as it docked with the station. Eric stood stretched and shoved the flower into a secured compartment beside the door. For all its intrigue, he wasn't about to start cuddling it. He had a feeling it wasn't going to turn into a cuddly little thing anytime soon. The hatch opened with a soft hiss, and the sterile air of Veyron Station rushed in. Eric stepped out into the clean metallic hallway, which was lined with touch-sensitive panels that hummed softly as his fingers brushed past them. Every inch of the place seemed to be made of polished chrome, every hallway and room bathed harsh white light, the kind of light that made everything look too perfect, too artificial. He had never liked this kind of place. And then, standing just outside the shuttle bay, was Kwai. She was a vision of cool authority, her tall frame draped in a sleek dark uniform that seemed to shimmer with some subtle alien material. Her long ears flicked back slightly as she spotted him, but her expression didn't change. Her eyes locked onto him like she was analyzing every little detail of his appearance, and maybe, just maybe, judging him for the state he was in. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair mused from the rough journey, and he had a scrape on his chin from his earlier encounter with the warder. Eric gave her a sheepish smile, not bothering to hide the fact that he was in fact a bit worn out. Well, that was a fun trip, he said, gesturing with a vague wave of his hand. You know, if you count almost getting eaten by an alien beast as fun. Chi raised an eyebrow, but didn't respond immediately. Instead, her gaze flicked to the flower secured in his compartment, her posture stiffening slightly. I trust you encountered no further complications. Eric waved his hand again, this time more dismissively. Oh, nothing too crazy, just a little monster problem, but nothing we couldn't handle. He paused. You might want to upgrade your station's re-entry briefing. It could use some serious work, gave a very subtle sigh. And Eric swore he could almost hear the words "not again" in the air. I will take that into consideration, she said dryly. Clearly not thrilled with his sarcasm. Now I suggest you follow me. We have much to discuss, and I am sure you're eager to complete your mission. Eric rolled his eyes but followed her anyway. What else was he going to do? He'd made it this far, and somehow, despite the awkwardness and the occasional near-death experience, he found himself oddly intrigued by this entire mess. They walked in silence for a while through more gleaming halls, past scientists in lab coats who were too absorbed in their own experiments to notice Eric or the alien woman beside him. Qui, however, remained stoic, her steps measured and purposeful, the kind of presence that made even the bustling scientists seem to step aside in quiet difference. Finally, they reached a large circular chamber with reinforced glass walls that looked out into the void. The room was lined with consoles, data readouts, and scanning equipment that hummed with life. In the center of the room stood a large transparent container at least 10 ft in diameter on a raised platform. It looked sterile, scientific, almost clinical in its design. That said, gesturing toward the container, is where you will place the neon bluebell. It needs to be stabilized before we can begin studying it. Eric raised an eyebrow. So no more outdoor adventures with the flower, no more monsters. Didn't smile, but there was the faintest glint of amusement in her eyes. The bluebell has served its purpose in your care. Now it is time for the next phase. Great, Eric muttered, eyeing the container suspiciously. A little glass box for the flower. I'd say I'm almost jealous. Without another word, stepped forward. Inputting a code into a console on the far wall, the transparent container hissed open, revealing a sleek climate controlled environment. Inside, it was designed to preserve delicate specimens with adjustable settings for temperature, humidity, and gravity. Eric was sure the flower would be perfectly comfortable. Assuming it didn't sprout legs and run away at the first opportunity, he placed the neon bluebell carefully inside, watching as the petals settled, still glowing faintly once it was in position. Quay pressed a button to seal the chamber. The soft hum of machinery filled the room, and the air seemed to thicken with the weight of anticipation. Now Quay began, turning to face Eric with her piercing gaze. I assume you have questions. Eric scratched the back of his neck, suddenly feeling like he was about to get caught in some kind of galactic conspiracy. Oh, I've got plenty, but let's start with the basics. Why the hell was this flower so important? I mean, sure, it glows. It has a weird connection with dangerous creatures, but you're not telling me this thing's just a flower, are you? Kai's softened slight. No, Eric, it's not just a flower. The neon bluebell has properties that could change the entire course of galactic history. Eric stared at her, his brain trying to process the words. Wait, what you're telling me? It's like a game changer. She nodded, her tone serious now. In a sense, its genetic makeup is unlike anything we've encountered before. It holds the key to unlocking a dormant energy source that could provide us with an unlimited supply of clean energy, but there is much more that we have yet to uncover. Eric blinked. So I just risk my life for an energy source? No biggie. She didn't laugh, but the foo's flicker of a smile touched her lips. In the grand scheme of things, yes, but we must proceed carefully. The energy it generates is volatile. If it falls into the wrong hands, galactic war, chaos, destruction, the usual. Eric said, cutting her off. So what's the next step? More dangerous alien creatures, or are we just going to sit here and wait for it to blow up in our faces? Ka's eyes locked onto his, her expression unyielding. Now we study it, and we find out just how far the flower's abilities extend. If we're lucky, we might just be able to harness its power without destroying everything. Eric looked at the flower in its glass enclosure, its soft glow almost mocking him in its serenity. Lucky, he muttered, is one thing I'm not counting on. Didn't respond, but there was something in the way she looked at him, like she already knew this was only the beginning of something much bigger. And as Eric stood there, caught between his skepticism and a strange, reluctant sense of purpose, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever came next, it was going to be one hell of a ride. The laboratory was quieter now, the hum of machinery less oppressive than before. It had taken weeks of study, scans, and rigorous testing before the neon bluebell had revealed its secrets, many of which still defied explanation. The once calm, serene glow of its petals had shifted into something more volatile. More unpredictable as its full potential had slowly unfolded, but Eric had long since stopped caring about the specifics of the science. The flower had done its job, and now it was time for him to do his own. It had been an entire month since that first mission on Neoria, and Eric had learned more than he ever thought he would about alien flora, dangerous creatures, and of course himself, the man who had once grumbled his way through every job, resenting every unnecessary detail, had changed. Maybe not by much, but enough to make him look at things differently, and maybe, just maybe, it was all thanks to the strange, glowing flower that had sent him on this wild ride. He sat in the same sterile lab where it had all started, watching as paced back and forth across the room, her long ears flicking with each of her calculated steps. Her eyes were focused as always, but there was something else behind them now, something more relaxed, almost amused. Though she'd never admit it, not aloud anyway, Eric had grown used to her cold efficiency, and yet he couldn't deny that there were times when her demeanor had softened, when she had looked at him not as a mere errand boy, but as someone useful, maybe even valuable. I still don't get how this works, Eric said, leaning back in his chair, his fingers tapping out a rhythm on the console before him. The flower, what's it really doing? Glanced over at him. You've asked me that question every day for the past week, and I'll ask it every day until I get a satisfying answer, Eric said with a smirk. Just one more time, please, she sighed, but a faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Very well. The flower genetic structure contains properties that interact with the quantum fields around it. It can harness energy from its surroundings, energy that until now we had no way of accessing. It's not just an energy source, Eric, it's a doorway, and once we learned to stabilize it, we began to unlock. Okay, I get it, Eric interrupted, raising his hands. It's more than just a pretty alien flower with a glowing vibe. I'm with you. Energy from quantum fields, great, but what does it mean? What happens now? Kwai paused, as if weighing her response. Her gaze softened slightly, and for a moment she was less the cold, calculating scientist and more the woman who had trusted him, reluctantly perhaps, but still trusted him. It means everything, Eric. The energy it produces could change the way entire civilizations function. We're on the verge of discovering how to tap into resources that were previously thought to be unreachable. Eric nodded slowly, processing the implications. So this wasn't just about getting a flower, this was bigger, a lot bigger. X's gaze locked onto his, and for a moment he saw a flicker of something more than just calculation in her eyes. Yes, the bluebell is not just an artifact, it is the key to something greater, something that could reshape the balance of power in the galaxy. Eric thought about that for a long moment, letting it sink in. The bluebell was just the beginning, and whatever came next, he was going to be right in the middle of it. He'd always known he was destined for more than scraping by living a mundane life, but he hadn't realized just how much more was waiting for him out there in the vast expanse of space. Well, I guess that means the real fun's just starting, he said, leaning back in his chair and folding his arms behind his head. I mean, if we're really talking about galaxy-altering tech, that, and I'm pretty sure I've just signed up for a permanent adventure. Kwai regarded him carefully, a smirk tugging at her lips. You've always had a sense of humor, Eric. It's a bit unexpected. Yeah, well, Eric shrugged. Guess I'm just learning to enjoy the ride. You know, you've got a weird way of teaching someone to grow. Who knew that saving a flower from an alien monster would lead to all this? Didn't answer right away, but her eyes softened ever so slightly then, and as though remembering her usual composure, she turned toward the data terminals, typing in a series of commands. I've arranged for the next phase of the study to begin. You've been invaluable during this process, Eric. The information you've gathered has been indispensable. Eric tilted his head, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. He'd gotten used to her cool professionalism, but this was different. She wasn't just talking about the mission anymore, she was acknowledging him. It was a strange feeling, one he hadn't anticipated. In a way, he realized they were both in this together. She may have had the science and the knowledge, but it was his willingness to face the danger head-on, his humanity, that had kept them moving forward. Does this mean you finally like me, or are you just being polite? Eric teased. Kwai shot him a sideways glance, but didn't respond immediately. Instead, she spoke with the precision that came naturally to her. I don't have to like you, Eric, but I respect you. That's more than I give most. People respect Eric, mused, raising an eyebrow. I can live with that. There was a long pause, and then Que let out a breath that sounded almost like a sigh. I suppose we both changed over the course of this mission. Eric chuckled. Yeah, I've gone from grumbling caretaker to intergalactic hero. Not bad, right? You're still grumbling, she said with a smile, her eyes glinting with amusement, but I suppose for you that's progress. He grinned. Hey, I'm still me, but maybe I'm a bit more aware of what I'm capable of now, and you QE, you're a little less well cold. Don't let it go to your head. Though Kwai arched an eyebrow but didn't argue. Perhaps, but for now we have more work to do. Eric nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. This was only the beginning. The flower, the energy, the galaxy, it was all coming together, and wherever it took him, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to be the same man who had stumbled onto this mission in the first place. He had been shaped by it, by the wild, unpredictable path that had started with a simple job and ended with an adventure that would alter the course of history. And as the stars drifted by outside the station's window, Eric couldn't help but grin. Whatever came next, he was ready. The universe was vast, and now he had a role to play in it. He didn't know exactly what that would look like, but for the first time in his life, he was eager to find out. The door to the lab slid open with a soft whoosh, and a new team of scientists filed in, eager to get started. Eric stood up, stretching his arms above his head. Let us get to work, then he said, his voice filled with a quiet confidence. I think we've only just scratched the surface. As the team busied themselves with the next round of experiments, Eric looked to Quay, who was now standing just a few paces away, her gaze still fixed on the work at hand. For a brief moment their eyes met, and he saw the same curiosity in her expression that he felt. This wasn't just about the flower anymore, it was about everything that came with it, and together they would face it all. The end.